The Tower of London's stone floor was ice-cold beneath Katherine Howard's knees as she practiced positioning her neck on an imaginary block. Her silk dress rustled against the rushes scattered across her cell floor, each movement deliberate, measured. Through the iron bars, 2 guards shifted uncomfortably, their armor clinking softly as they watched this 19-year-old girl rehearse her own death. She counted under her breath, 1 step from the door, 2 to kneel, 3 seconds to position her neck just so. The block would be low, she'd been told. She needed to practice the angle. Her shallow breathing echoed off the stone walls as she lowered her head again, adjusting the tilt of her chin. Tomorrow morning, there would be no room for error. The candle flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across her pale hands as she gripped the edge of her dress. She whispered fragments of prayers between each practice run, her voice barely audible above the distant drip of water somewhere in the tower's depths. "Forgive me for loving," she breathed, rising to try again. The guards looked away as she perfected the placement of her neck, memorizing exactly how far forward she needed to lean. But how did a teenage girl's innocent romance become grounds for beheading? And why did Henry VIII create bedroom rules so horrifying that even hardened executioners looked away in disgust? To understand how love became treason and intimacy became torture, we need to rewind 6 marriages and uncover the surveillance state that turned Tudor bedchambers into crime scenes. What you're about to hear will change how you see history forever. The servants entered Catherine of Aragon's bedchamber at dawn, carrying silver bowls and surgical instruments. Their footsteps whispered across the stone floor as morning light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating the rumpled sheets they'd come to examine. Catherine pressed herself against the headboard, clutching her nightgown closed as 6 men filed into her most private space. The lead physician's quill scratched against parchment, already documenting what he hadn't yet seen. "Your Majesty must stand," he commanded, his voice clinical as a butcher appraising meat. The metallic clink of instruments being arranged on the bedside table made Catherine flinch. She rose on trembling legs while servants stripped the bed with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed from years of this ritual. The sheets rustled like autumn leaves as they were spread across the floor, every fold examined under the physician's magnifying glasses. But the physicians weren't just looking for blood. They counted stains, measured their circumference, noted their placement on the linen. One physician knelt beside the sheets, pressing his nose close to smell for authenticity, while another held the fabric to the light, searching for evidence of tampering. Catherine stood barefoot on the cold floor, watching strangers catalogue the most intimate moments of her wedding night. A servant transcribed their findings in meticulous detail, each observation another violation written in permanent ink. "The virgin's blood appears sufficient," the lead physician announced, though his tone suggested disappointment. He gestured for Catherine to return to the bed. She climbed back onto the bare mattress, its horsehair filling visible through torn seams. The physicians circled her like wolves, noting the bruises on her arms where Henry had gripped her, the bite marks on her shoulder that proved his passion. Their cold fingers prodded her flesh, measuring each mark's dimensions for their report. What they wrote in those reports would haunt every future queen. Outside the bedchamber door, more servants waited with empty chamber pots and fresh linens. They'd been stationed there all night, ordered to document every sound that escaped the royal bedroom. Their testimony would join the physician's findings in the official consummation records. One maid clutched her notes with shaking hands, having transcribed Catherine's cries of pain when Henry first took her. Another servant had tallied the king's grunts of satisfaction, proof of his virility for the court records. The examination continued for 3 hours. Physicians inspected Catherine's body with the same detachment they'd show a corpse, noting every detail that might prove or disprove successful consummation. They checked beneath her fingernails for Henry's skin, examined her thighs for his seed, even inspected her hair for signs of passionate pulling. Each discovery was announced aloud for the scribes to record, turning Catherine's wedding night into a medical inventory. And this was just the beginning of the surveillance. Henry himself arrived as the physicians finished their work, his massive frame filling the doorway. He surveyed the scene with satisfaction, watching his new bride shiver on the stripped bed while strangers catalogued their intimacy. "Excellent work, gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. The Pope will receive a full report by week's end. Catherine pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly understanding that this violation wasn't just personal, it was political. The king's appetite for documentation would only grow. Within months, he ordered servants to maintain detailed logs of Catherine's monthly cycles, searching for signs of pregnancy. Ladies in waiting were instructed to examine her chamber pot contents each morning, checking for blood that might indicate miscarriage or menstruation. The Queen's body became public property, every function scrutinized and recorded in ledgers that still survive in dusty archives today. These invasive rituals set the precedent for every queen who followed. When Anne Boleyn married Henry years later, she knew what awaited her on her wedding morning. The same physicians, now older and more efficient, would enter her chambers with their instruments and ledgers. The same servants would strip her bed and examine her body, searching for proof that the king had claimed his prize. The surveillance state that began in Catherine's bedchamber would expand to consume them all. But if Catherine thought this invasion of privacy was horrifying, she had no idea that Henry was already planning something far worse, installing the eyes that would watch through walls. The carpenter's hands shook as he drilled the third hole into Anne Boleyn's bedchamber wall. Wood shavings curled onto the floor like tiny secrets, each spiral another betrayal of the Queen's privacy. His breath came in short gasps as he pressed his eye to the fresh opening, testing the view of the royal bed. Perfect. The angle captured everything from the pillows to the foot of the mattress. Behind him, Thomas Cromwell's boots clicked against the stone floor in measured rhythm. The king's chief minister ran his fingers along the wall's tapestry, feeling for the other holes hidden beneath embroidered roses and hunting scenes. 27 openings in total, he counted, each one positioned to provide a different vantage point of the Queen's most intimate moments. The carpenter wiped sweat from his brow despite the chamber's chill. The surveillance network required more than just holes. Cromwell had assembled a team of 12 watchers, men chosen for their keen eyesight and ability to remain motionless for hours. They would work in shifts, pressing their faces against the cold stone walls, documenting every movement in the royal bedchamber. Their written reports would pile on Cromwell's desk each morning, describing in clinical detail how the Queen undressed, how she touched her husband, what sounds escaped her lips in darkness. But these weren't the only eyes watching. Servants had been recruited to supplement the wall observers. Anne's own ladies in waiting received new instructions whispered in palace corridors. They were to note the Queen's facial expressions during intimate moments, count the frequency of her visits to Henry's chamber, even observe how she walked the morning after coupling. One lady in waiting later testified that she'd been ordered to smell the Queen's undergarments for evidence of other men's seed. The construction work continued for weeks. Carpenters hollowed out spaces behind walls, creating narrow passages where observers could stand for hours without detection. They installed small shelves to hold candles and writing materials, ensuring the spies could document their observations in real time. The scratching of quills against parchment became a constant sound behind the palace walls, though few realized its source. Anne first noticed something amiss when she caught a glint of light where none should exist. She'd been brushing her hair before the mirror when she spotted it, a tiny reflection in the wall's dark paneling. Her hand froze mid-stroke. The bristles caught in her dark tresses as she turned slowly, studying the innocent-looking tapestry. There, another glimmer, barely visible unless you knew where to look. She approached the wall with deliberate calm, her silk slippers silent on the floor. Her fingertips traced the embroidered patterns until they found the tiny opening. Cold air whispered through from the other side. Anne's breath caught as she realized someone could be watching at that very moment. She pressed her palm flat against the hole, feeling the slight warmth that suggested recent occupation. What the spies saw that night would later appear in her trial. The Queen began changing her behavior, but every adaptation only provided more intelligence for her observers. When she started undressing in the far corner of her chamber, the spies noted her newfound modesty. When she hung additional tapestries over suspicious spots, they documented her paranoia. Even her attempts at privacy became evidence of guilt in the meticulous reports that accumulated in palace archives. The psychological toll manifested in small ways at first. Anne developed a nervous habit of glancing at walls during conversations. She startled at unexpected sounds. wondering if they came from within the walls themselves. Her sleep grew fitful as she imagined eyes watching her toss and turn. The very architecture of her home had become her enemy. Every surface a potential betrayal. Henry received updates from the surveillance network during his morning meetings. Cromwell would present the reports with bureaucratic efficiency, reading aloud the watchers' observations of the Queen's nighttime activities. The King's expression would darken or brighten depending on what intimacies his spies had witnessed. He particularly enjoyed hearing about moments when Anne thought herself unobserved, her private prayers and whispered fears. The spy holes served a dual purpose that even Anne didn't initially grasp. Beyond simple observation, they created a psychological prison more effective than iron bars. The Queen could never be certain when she was being watched, or by how many eyes. Every moment became a performance, every gesture potentially criminal. The constant surveillance transformed her from a woman into evidence. And then Anne made the fatal mistake. One evening, believing herself alone, she spoke aloud to her reflection about her fears of producing a male heir. The words tumbled out in a desperate whisper, confessing doubts about Henry's ability to father sons. Behind the wall, 3 observers scribbled furiously, capturing every treasonous syllable. Her private anguish would later be presented as proof of her disloyalty to the crown. The network expanded beyond the bedchamber as Henry's paranoia grew. Peepholes appeared in Anne's private chapel, her bathing chambers, even the corridors she walked. Observers learned to recognize her footsteps, her breathing patterns, the particular rustle of her favorite gown. They created a comprehensive catalogue of her existence, transforming a living woman into data points on parchment. Some spies developed an uncomfortable intimacy with their subject. They watched Anne weep after miscarriages, saw her practice smiling in the mirror before court appearances, observed her counting on her fingers the days since Henry last visited her bed. These men knew her better than her closest confidantes, yet she would never know their faces. Their reports grew detailed beyond mere surveillance, noting the way candlelight caught her tears, how her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. The construction of spy holes required careful planning to avoid detection. Carpenters worked only during loud court celebrations, when drilling sounds would be masked by music. They chose locations where natural shadows would hide the openings, where tapestries could hang without suspicion. The palace walls became riddled with these violations, a honeycomb of watching spaces that would outlive the queens they were built to observe. By the time of Anne's arrest, the surveillance reports filled 17 volumes. Prosecutors would quote from them extensively during her trial, reading aloud intimate moments she thought were private. The judges heard how she touched herself when alone, how she sometimes refused Henry's advances, how she'd once thrown a pillow at the wall where she suspected eyes were watching. Every human moment became criminal evidence. The spies had seen enough to seal Anne's fate, but for Henry's next wife, the surveillance would move from the walls into her very body. Every morning at 6 a.m., Jane Seymour had to provide a urine sample while 4 physicians watched. The crystal chamber pot caught the first rays of dawn filtering through her bedroom window, its contents gleaming amber as she handed it to the waiting doctor. His leather gloves creaked as he lifted the vessel to eye level, swirling the liquid like a sommelier examining wine. 3 other physicians crowded close, their breath fogging in the cold morning air as they peered at the Queen's most private offering. The lead physician dipped a silver rod into the warm urine, stirring slowly while his colleagues took notes. Their quills scratched against parchment, recording the colour, clarity, and consistency of Jane's morning water. She stood barefoot on the stone floor, her nightgown hanging loose around her thin frame, watching these men analyze her bodily functions with scientific fascination. The youngest physician bent low, inhaling deeply above the chamber pot, before announcing his findings to the group. The examinations had started the day after her wedding. Jane woke to find her bedchamber transformed into a medical laboratory, with tables covered in glass vials and mysterious instruments. The physicians explained their daily routine with clinical detachment, how they would monitor every aspect of her body's functioning to ensure the swift arrival of a male heir. Her monthly bleeding, her morning sickness, even the texture of her skin would become data points in their obsessive documentation. The morning examinations were just the start. After the urine analysis, physicians inspected Jane's tongue, pressed their ears against her belly, and counted her pulse beats against an hourglass. They recorded the temperature of her skin at different points on her body, believing that warmth in certain areas indicated conception. One physician specialized in examining her fingernails, claiming their color revealed secrets about her womb's receptivity. Another studied the whites of her eyes, searching for the telltale bloodshot veins that might herald pregnancy. Jane learned to strip without being asked. The physicians needed to examine her breasts daily, checking for swelling or tenderness that might indicate new life growing within. They measured her nipples with calipers, documenting any changes in size or coloration. Cold metal pressed against warm flesh as they took their measurements, while Jane stared at the ceiling and tried to think of anything except the stranger's hands on her body. Her menstrual cycles became public record. Ladies in waiting were instructed to save her soiled linens for physician inspection. The doctors would spread the bloodied cloth across tables, analyzing flow patterns and clot formation. They believed the appearance of her monthly blood could predict fertility, so every stain was preserved, catalogued, and studied. Servants whispered about the locked room where hundreds of the Queen's used menstrual cloths hung from lines like macabre laundry. They found her dream journal on the third week. Jane had been recording her dreams in a private diary, never imagining the pages would be seized for medical analysis. The physicians pored over her nighttime visions with scholarly intensity, believing dreams revealed the womb's secrets. They interpreted flying dreams as signs of conception, water dreams as impending miscarriage. Every symbolic image became evidence in their fertility investigations. One entry made the physicians gasp aloud. Jane had dreamed of giving birth to a fish, its silver scales glinting as it flopped on her bedsheets. The lead physician declared this proof of a malformed womb, capable only of producing monsters. He ordered increased examinations, more invasive procedures to correct whatever deficiency her subconscious had revealed. Jane watched them debate her dream's meaning, her most private thoughts dissected like a corpse on their examination table. The dream analysis expanded into waking observations. Physicians noted which foods Jane craved, believing dietary preferences indicated the sex of potential offspring. They monitored her sleep positions, convinced that women who slept on their left sides bore daughters. Even her choice of clothing colors was documented, with red garments supposedly encouraging male conception. Every aspect of her existence became medical evidence. Henry attended some examinations personally. His massive form would appear in the doorway during morning urine collection, watching with keen interest as physicians performed their tests. He questioned them about Jane's fertility signs, demanding detailed explanations of their findings. Sometimes, he would approach the examination table himself, running his thick fingers over the charts and diagrams that mapped his wife's reproductive potential. Her urine changed color on a Tuesday morning in September. The physicians nearly dropped the chamber pot in their excitement. The darker hue suggested pregnancy, they declared, though further tests were needed for confirmation. They divided the sample into a dozen vials, adding various substances to test reactions. One physician mixed the urine with wine, another with wheat grains. They watched for fermentation, precipitation, any sign that might confirm new life growing in the Queen's womb. Word spread through the palace within hours. Servants whispered about the Queen's changed water. Courtiers speculated about a potential heir. Jane found herself surrounded by congratulations for something that might not even exist. The physicians increased their examinations to twice daily, desperate to confirm their diagnosis. They collected samples of her saliva, her tears, even strands of her hair for analysis. The pressure intensified with each passing day. Henry visited Jane's bedchamber more frequently, his eyes scanning her body for visible signs of pregnancy. He ordered the physicians to try experimental treatments, strange concoctions meant to strengthen the womb and ensure a male child. Jane drank bitter herbal mixtures that made her gag, submitted to fumigation procedures that left her gasping for clean air. The physicians developed new theories constantly. One believed that examining Jane's earwax could predict the child's temperament. Another insisted on daily measurements of her shadow's length, claiming it revealed the baby's growth rate. They brought in specialists who studied the pattern of veins in her hands, the arrangement of moles on her back, the sound of her heartbeat at different times of day. Jane's pregnancy was confirmed through a grotesque ritual. The physicians made her urinate on wheat and barley seeds, then monitored which sprouted first. When the wheat grew faster, they declared she carried a son. Henry rewarded each physician with gold coins while Jane sat exhausted on her bed, watching strange men celebrate her body's productivity. She had become a garden, tended by gardeners who cared only for the fruit she might bear. Her belly swelled through spring and into summer. The examinations grew more invasive, as physicians charted the baby's position through external palpation. They pressed wooden listening tubes against her skin, claiming to hear the child's thoughts. One physician insisted he could determine the baby's intelligence by the pattern of kicks against Jane's ribs. Their hands never stopped probing, measuring, documenting her changing form. Labour began on an October morning with the physicians already assembled. They had prepared for weeks, arranging instruments and drafting observation charts. Jane's screams echoed off the chamber walls as contractions seized her body. Between waves of pain, she saw the physicians scribbling notes about her suffering, timing her cries with mechanical precision. Even her agony became data for their medical records. The birth lasted 3 days and 2 nights. Physicians rotated in shifts, maintaining constant observation of the Queen's ordeal. They documented every detail: the colour of fluids that gushed from her body, the rhythm of her contractions, the prayers she gasped between pushes. When infection set in, they noted the fever's progression with scholarly detachment. Jane's eyes rolled back as poison spread through her blood, but still the physicians wrote, their quills never pausing. Prince Edward's first cry coincided with his mother's last breath. The physicians recorded both events with equal interest, noting the exact time of birth and death. They examined the placenta before attending to the dying Queen, more concerned with signs of future fertility than Jane's fading pulse. As servants prepared her body for burial, the physicians compiled their final reports, satisfied that their surveillance had produced the desired result, a male heir, even at the cost of the garden that grew him. Jane died, giving Henry his only son, but her replacement would face something even worse than medical torture. She would have to embrace a man whose body was literally rotting away. The smell hit Anne of Cleves before she even entered the bedchamber. Rotting flesh mixed with expensive perfume created a nauseating cloud that made her eyes water. She pressed a silk handkerchief to her nose, but the stench penetrated the delicate fabric. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged knowing glances as they led her toward the heavy oak door. The corridor seemed endless, each step bringing stronger waves of that horrific odour. Behind the door she could hear Henry's laboured breathing, punctuated by wet, rattling coughs. The floorboards creaked under his massive weight as he shifted in bed. Anne's stomach clenched as a servant opened the door, releasing a fresh wave of putrefaction into the hallway. The ladies-in-waiting stepped back instinctively, but Anne had no choice but to enter. The bedchamber was dark, despite dozens of candles burning on every surface. Their flames flickered in the draught, casting dancing shadows across tapestries that couldn't quite mask the smell. Henry lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his bloated form barely recognizable as human. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the pus that seeped from open sores on his scalp. Anne forced herself to smile as she approached the bed, but the smell was only the first horror. As she drew closer, Anne saw the source of the stench. Henry's left leg was wrapped in bandages that had turned yellow and brown with discharge. The fabric was soaked through, and something dark was seeping onto the silk sheets. The king shifted, and the bandages squelched audibly. A chunk of something fell from beneath the wrappings, landing on the bed with a soft, wet sound. Anne bit down hard on her tongue to keep from gagging. The physicians had warned her about the leg ulcers, but their clinical descriptions hadn't prepared her for this reality. The wounds never healed, they explained, constantly weeping pus and rotting flesh. The infection had spread deep into the bone, creating cavities that oozed continuously. Servants changed the bedding 3 times daily, burning the contaminated linens in special furnaces far from the palace. The smoke from those fires carried its own particular stench that palace workers learned to recognize. Henry reached out with swollen fingers, beckoning Anne closer. His breathing was laboured, each exhale carrying the sweet smell of internal decay. She moved to the bed's edge, careful not to disturb the bandages. The mattress dipped under her weight, and she heard liquids shifting within the wounds. Something warm and wet touched her hand through the sheets. The king's body had become a battlefield of infection and decay. Beyond the famous leg ulcers, boils covered his back and shoulders. Some had burst, leaving craters that refused to heal. Others swelled with pus, creating painful lumps beneath his nightshirt. The physicians lanced them regularly, but new ones appeared faster than the old ones drained. Each movement caused fresh eruptions of fluid and the release of trapped gases that smelled like death itself. Anne learned to breathe through her mouth during their encounters. She discovered that if she pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth, she could minimize the taste of decay that permeated the air. Her ladies taught her to dab perfume inside her nostrils before entering the bedchamber, though it only masked the worst of the smell. They also showed her how to position herself to avoid the worst affected areas of Henry's body. What Anne saw when the covers lifted made her bite through her own lip. The king's nightshirt had ridden up, revealing the full extent of his physical deterioration. The leg ulcers were worse than the bandages suggested. Deep craters of rotting flesh, exposed bone in places, with angry red streaks radiating outward where infection spread through blood vessels. Maggots writhed in the deepest wounds, placed there by physicians who believed they would eat only dead tissue. Their white bodies glistened in the candlelight as they feasted. Henry seemed unaware of Anne's horror. The constant pain had numbed him to others' reactions. He spoke of court matters while pus dripped onto the sheets, discussing trade agreements as chunks of necrotic tissue sloughed off his leg. Anne nodded and responded appropriately, her voice steady even as bile rose in her throat. She had quickly learned that showing disgust meant risking her life. The intimate aspects of their marriage presented unique challenges. Henry's size and infections made physical contact not just unpleasant, but dangerous. The physicians warned Anne about the risk of catching the infections, advising her to avoid direct contact with the wounds. Yet the king expected his marital rights, regardless of his body's decay. Anne developed strategies to fulfill her duties while minimizing exposure to the worst of his condition. She learned to focus on distant sounds during their encounters, the night birds calling outside the window, servants' footsteps in distant corridors, the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Anything to distract from the squelching sounds the mattress made beneath Henry's infected body, the wet noises of wounds reopening with movement, the bubbling wheeze of his breathing as exertion taxed his diseased lungs. Sometimes during their coupling, pieces of Henry would literally fall away. Dead skin would slough off in sheets, sticking to Anne's body. Scabs would crack and bleed, leaving rust-coloured stains on her nightgown. Once, a particularly large chunk of infected flesh dropped onto her breast, and she had to remain still, pretending ecstasy while fighting the urge to vomit. The servants would find these pieces later, sweeping them into bags for burning. And then came the night something fell off. Anne had positioned herself carefully, avoiding the worst of the ulcers while fulfilling her wifely duties. Henry's breathing was more laboured than usual, his massive chest heaving with effort. Suddenly, he cried out in pain rather than pleasure. Anne felt something give way beneath her hand where she'd braced herself against his thigh. When she looked down, a piece of his flesh the size of a child's fist had separated completely from his leg, revealing white bone beneath. Blood and pus gushed from the fresh wound, soaking instantly through the sheets. Henry roared in agony, his whole body convulsing. Physicians rushed into the chamber, summoned by his cries. They pushed Anne aside, working frantically to stem the bleeding. She stood naked and trembling, watching them pack the gaping hole with herbs and honey. The severed flesh lay on the bed like discarded meat, already attracting flies despite the late hour. That piece of the king's body was just one of many that would fall away in the coming months. The physicians kept them in jars, studying the progression of decay. They developed theories about which tissues would separate next, placing wagers on whether it would be from his leg or his back. Anne once discovered their collection, dozens of glass containers filled with floating chunks of royal flesh. The sight haunted her dreams for weeks afterward. The smell grew worse as more tissue died. Servants burned incense constantly, creating a fog of smoke that made eyes water. They scattered dried herbs on the floors and hung pomanders from the bed curtains. Nothing helped. The stench of decay had permeated the very stones of the palace. Even Anne's own chambers began to smell of death, the odour clinging to her hair and clothes after each visit to Henry's bed. Her survival strategy evolved into an art form. Anne learned to interpret the king's moods through the state of his wounds. Increased discharge meant heightened irritability. Fresh bleeding indicated a day when any wrong word might mean death. She studied the patterns of his decay like other queens had studied his political alliances, using the information to navigate their encounters safely. She discovered that praising his virility during moments when flesh literally fell from his bones earned his favour. Expressing admiration for his strength while helping physicians rebandage weeping sores made him forget her initial revulsion. Anne became an actress of the highest calibre, her performance so convincing that Henry believed she desired him despite the obvious decay. The servants who attended these bedchamber scenes developed their own coping mechanisms. Some stuffed their nostrils with wax, others chewed strong herbs to overwhelm their sense of smell. The laundresses who handled the soiled bedding wore thick gloves and masks, burning the linens in special furnaces located downwind from the palace. They called it feeding the flesh fires, and the job paid triple normal wages due to its horrific nature. Anne's ladies-in-waiting created a secret support system. They would bathe her immediately after each encounter with Henry, scrubbing her skin raw to remove any traces of infection. They burned her nightgowns and provided fresh ones, ensuring nothing contaminated lingered. These women risked their positions to help their mistress survive the biological horror of her marriage. One evening, the king's condition deteriorated dramatically. The leg ulcers had merged into one massive wound that exposed most of his shin bone. Infection had spread to his other leg, creating matching craters of decay. His back wept constantly through his shirts, leaving outline stains of his sores on every chair. Yet still he demanded Anne's presence in his bed, his appetites undiminished by his body's betrayal. The physicians tried increasingly desperate treatments. They applied molten lead to cauterize wounds, filling the bedchamber with the smell of burning flesh. They used red-hot pokers to drain abscesses, Henry's screams echoing through the palace. Anne was required to attend these procedures, holding the king's hand while doctors carved away dead tissue. She watched them fill buckets with removed flesh, her expression carefully neutral. Some nights, Henry's fever rose so high he became delirious. He would call Anne by his previous wives' names, demanding intimacies while his wounds gaped open. She played whatever role his fevered mind required, knowing that correction might mean death. The stench during these episodes was unbearable, as increased body temperature accelerated the decay. Servants stood ready with buckets, knowing the king often vomited from his own smell. The bedchamber itself began to show signs of contamination. Dark stains spread across the ceiling above the bed where noxious vapours had risen. The floorboards near the bed rotted from constant exposure to draining wounds. Expensive tapestries had to be destroyed after absorbing too much of the smell. The room was becoming as diseased as its occupant. Anne survived by pretending revulsion was reverence. But young Katherine Howard wouldn't have that option. For her, the rules would be written in blood. Katherine Howard's lady-in-waiting heard the Queen whispering, "I can't, I can't, I can't," behind the bedchamber door. The young woman pressed her ear against the oak panels, catching fragments of prayer mixed with those desperate denials. Inside, silk rustled against skin as Katherine paced the narrow space between bed and window. Her bare feet whispered across cold stone, counting steps like a prisoner measuring her cell. The summons had arrived an hour earlier. Henry wanted his young bride in his chambers before the midnight bell. Catherine's breathing hitched as she read the message, her fingers leaving damp prints on the parchment. The servant who delivered it kept his eyes lowered, knowing what such invitations meant. Every woman in the palace understood the price of hesitation. Katherine forced herself to stop pacing. She sat at her dressing table, studying her reflection in the polished silver mirror. 19 years old, with auburn hair that caught candlelight like spun copper. Her ladies had already prepared her body for the king's pleasure, bathing her in rosewater, braiding pearls through her hair. They worked in silence, their touches gentle as they dressed her for what felt like sacrifice. The penalties for refusing a king's advances were written in the law books that lined Cromwell's study. Denial of conjugal rights constituted treason when the denied party wore a crown. 3 judges had already signed death warrants for women who claimed headaches or monthly bleeding when summoned to Henry's bed. Their executions served as lessons to future queens about the consequences of reluctance. Catherine lifted the perfume bottle with trembling hands. The crystal stopper clinked against the rim as she dabbed scent behind her ears, along her throat, between her breasts. Each drop was armour against what waited in Henry's chambers. She had learned from Anne of Cleves which fragrances best masked the smell of decay. Lavender for the sweetness of rot, rosemary for the sharpness of infection, mint for the sourness of old sweat. Her lady-in-waiting entered without knocking. Mary Lascelles had served 2 queens before Catherine, and her face showed the strain of such service. She carried a silver cup filled with wine mixed with herbs, a concoction designed to dull the senses without causing obvious intoxication. Catherine drank deeply, tasting bitter wormwood beneath the grape. "His Majesty grows impatient," Mary whispered, adjusting the laces of Catherine's bodice. The fabric pulled tight across her ribs, making each breath deliberate. Mary's fingers worked with practiced efficiency, creating the perfect silhouette of willing bride. Neither woman spoke of what those same fingers had done for Jane Seymour, tightening her corset to hide morning sickness, loosening it to accommodate swelling. The walk to Henry's chambers took 5 minutes that stretched like hours. Catherine's silk slippers made no sound on the stone floors. Guards stood at attention as she passed, their eyes fixed straight ahead. They had watched this procession before with different queens, different girls pretending desire while their hearts hammered with dread. The torches flickered in their sconces, casting shadows that danced like spectres. Outside Henry's door, Catherine paused. She could hear movement within, the creak of the massive bed as Henry shifted his weight. The physician's voice murmured instructions to servants about fresh bandages and clean sheets. A metallic scent escaped through the gap beneath the door, mixing with incense that couldn't quite disguise what lay beyond. She had learned the art of false desire from her cousin Anne Boleyn's example. Before her arrest, Anne had shared secrets with young Catherine during a family gathering. The key was focusing on pleasant memories while enduring unpleasant realities. Think of summer gardens while his hands explored. Remember the taste of honey cakes while his breath wheezed against your neck. Count rose petals in your mind when counting seconds became unbearable. The door opened before Catherine could knock. Dr. Butts emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth already stained yellow and brown. His eyes met hers with professional detachment, the same look he gave when examining corpses. He stepped aside without words, revealing the candlelit chamber beyond. The smell rolled out like fog, thick and cloying despite every attempt at ventilation. Henry reclined against a mountain of pillows, his massive form draped in crimson silk that couldn't hide the lumps and valleys of his decay. Fresh bandages wrapped his legs, already showing spots where fluid seeped through. His face turned toward her, eyes bright with fever and appetite. The smile that spread across his bloated features might have been charming on a healthy man. "My Rose," he called, his voice thick with phlegm. One swollen hand patted the mattress beside him, sending ripples through the silk coverlet. Catherine moved forward on legs that wanted to run backward. Each step brought stronger waves of that familiar stench. Death and desire mingled into something monstrous. Her smile never wavered. The bed dipped dangerously as she settled beside him. Springs groaned under their combined weight, a sound she had learned to associate with dread. Henry's hand found hers, fingers like sausages wrapped around her delicate bones. His skin felt hot and damp through her gloves. When he lifted her hand to his lips, she felt moisture that wasn't saliva. "You look exquisite tonight," Henry murmured against her palm. His breath carried notes of internal rot that made her stomach clench. Catherine forced herself to lean closer, letting her hair fall forward to brush his cheek. The move was calculated, practiced before her mirror until it looked natural. Henry made a sound of pleasure that ended in a wet cough. She had memorized which topics distracted him from immediate physical demands. "Tell me of your day, my lord," she whispered, trailing fingers along his silk sleeve while avoiding the flesh beneath. Henry launched into complaints about French ambassadors, his voice gaining strength with indignation. Catherine nodded and gasped at appropriate moments, playing the attentive wife while buying precious time. Other queens had tried different tactics. Catherine of Aragon attempted reasoning, explaining theological arguments against forced intimacy. Anne Boleyn used wit and charm to deflect until deflection itself became treason. Jane Seymour's compliance killed her with childbirth. Anne of Cleves's obvious disgust nearly cost her head. Each failure taught Catherine new survival strategies. The candles burned lower as Henry talked. Melted wax pooled on silver holders, creating shapes that looked like frozen screams. Catherine watched shadows dance on the tapestries, counting minutes until she could claim fatigue. The king's hand had moved to her knee, fingers tracing patterns through silk. Each touch required a response, a sigh or shift that suggested pleasure rather than revulsion. A servant entered with fresh bandages. The interruption came like salvation, allowing Catherine to shift away while maintaining concerned attention. She watched the physician unwrap Henry's leg, revealing horrors that had become routine. The ulcer had grown since morning, edges black with dead tissue. White bone gleamed through the deepest parts. Catherine made sympathetic noises while breathing through her mouth. "Leave us," Henry commanded once the rewrapping finished. The servants fled with visible relief, doors closing with finality. Catherine found herself alone with the king's expectations and her own thundering pulse. Henry's eyes had taken on the glassy look that preceded his worst demands. One hand fumbled with her bodice laces. She responded with practiced enthusiasm, making the small sounds he expected while her mind escaped elsewhere. The trick was maintaining enough awareness to react appropriately while dissociating from the physical reality. Too much distance, and she might miss cues that demanded response. Too little, and she might vomit or weep, either reaction potentially fatal. Henry's breathing grew more laboured as passion overtook him. The wet rattle in his chest competed with his grunts of pleasure. Catherine focused on the mechanics of survival. Arch here, moan there, whisper endearments that meant nothing. Her body performed while her mind counted tapestry threads, traced ceiling beam patterns, composed letters she would never send. Something warm and wet soaked through her shift. Another bandage had failed, releasing its cargo of infection. Catherine bit her tongue until she tasted copper, using that sharp pain to anchor herself. Henry seemed unaware of the new stain spreading between them. His fever-bright eyes saw only what they wanted, a young wife eager for his touch. The art of feigning passion became more critical as Henry's body deteriorated. Previous queens had failed this test in different ways. Some showed their disgust too plainly. Others overcompensated with false enthusiasm that rang hollow. Catherine had found the balance through careful observation of courtesans who visited before her marriage. She studied their movements, their sounds, their perfectly timed responses. Practice came during daylight hours when she was alone. Catherine would lie in her own bed, rehearsing expressions of pleasure in her mirror. She learned which muscles to tense, which sounds carried conviction. Her ladies thought she primped from vanity. In truth, she prepared for survival, turning her body into a weapon of deception. The midnight bell finally tolled. Henry's passion spent itself in wet coughs and exhausted wheezing. Catherine lay still as he drifted towards sleep, counting his breaths until they steadied. Only then did she dare move, extracting herself from his unconscious embrace with careful precision. Her shift clung to her skin where his wounds had wept through the fabric. She dressed in darkness, fingers finding laces by touch alone. The trick was leaving quickly enough to avoid morning demands, but slowly enough to seem reluctant. Catherine had timed this escape many times, knowing exactly how long each element required. Soft footsteps carried her to the door where guards waited to escort her back. Her own chambers felt like sanctuary after Henry's charnel house. Mary Lascelles waited with hot water and clean clothes, her face carefully neutral. They worked in silence, born of repetition, stripping away contaminated garments for burning. The washing came next, harsh soap scrubbing away every trace of the king's touch. Catherine submitted to the cleansing ritual while her mind finally allowed itself to process the horror. "You did well, my lady," Mary whispered as she combed out Catherine's hair. The words carried weight beyond simple praise. Other ladies in waiting hadn't been able to offer such comfort to their mistresses. Some queens had broken down after encounters with Henry, weeping or raging in ways that found their way back to his ears. Catherine had learned to save her tears for private moments. She thought of Francis Dereham then, allowing herself that dangerous luxury, her first love, who touched her with gentle hands that smelled of ink and leather instead of decay. Their stolen moments seemed like another lifetime, before she understood that past affections could become present treasons. Francis had shown her what desire actually felt like, making her performance with Henry possible through contrast. Sleep came slowly despite exhaustion. Catherine lay in her clean bed, listening to night sounds beyond her window. Somewhere in the palace, servants burned her discarded shift, adding its smoke to the flesh fires that never quite ceased. Tomorrow would bring another summons, another performance, another survival. The cycle would continue until Henry found fault with her act. She had learned the cost of showing reluctance from her predecessors' fates. Anne Boleyn's trial records included testimony about times she refused Henry's advances, claiming headaches or exhaustion. Such denials accumulated like evidence, proof of a cold nature unbefitting a queen. The judges counted each refusal as a small treason, building toward the ultimate charge of adultery. Even successful performances carried risk. Catherine knew Henry's physicians kept detailed records of his intimate encounters, noting frequency and enthusiasm levels. Too much apparent pleasure might suggest experience beyond the marriage bed. Too little indicated the frigidity that had doomed Catherine of Aragon. The balance required constant calculation, exhausting in its precision. Her dreams, when they finally came, mixed memory with nightmare. Francis Dereham's young face morphed into Henry's bloated features. Sweet words became wet coughs. Gentle touches transformed into grasping hands that left stains. Catherine woke gasping, sheets twisted around her like bonds. Mary appeared with watered wine and soothing words, another ritual grown familiar through repetition. Dawn brought temporary reprieve. Henry rarely summoned wives during daylight, preferring darkness to hide his deterioration. Catherine used these hours to maintain her mask of contentment. She appeared at court functions, smiling and laughing as if the previous night hadn't happened. Other courtiers played along, everyone complicit in the deception that royal marriages contained mutual desire. The other wives watched her carefully. Lady Rochford, who had served Anne Boleyn, sometimes caught Catherine's eye with knowing looks. These women understood the performance required, having witnessed or endured similar demands. They formed an unspoken sisterhood of survival, sharing strategies through careful conversation. A mention of effective perfumes here, a suggestion about helpful wines there. Catherine learned to read Henry's condition through servant gossip. Increased laundry meant his wounds worsened. Extra physician visits suggested fever spikes that made him more demanding. She planned her responses accordingly, adjusting her performance to match his state. The sicker he grew, the more enthusiasm he required to maintain his illusions of virility. Some nights she wondered how long she could maintain the charade. Each encounter required greater effort as her revulsion grew. The careful balance of her act wobbled when exhaustion peaked. One poorly chosen word, one moment of visible disgust, and she would join her cousin in the tower. The margin for error narrowed with each passing month. Letters from home reminded her why she endured. Her family's fortune depended on her position as queen. The Howard name had risen with her marriage, bringing wealth and influence to relatives who urged her continued success. They never asked about the cost of that success, the nights spent performing passion for a rotting king. Their letters spoke only of gratitude and expectations. She developed physical symptoms from the sustained stress. Headaches plagued her days, born from constantly clenched jaw muscles. Her stomach rebelled against food, knowing what evening might require. Mary prepared special teas to calm nerves and settle digestion, medicines that became as essential as the perfumes that masked Henry's stench. The irony wasn't lost on her. Before marriage, she had known real desire with Francis, felt the quickening pulse of genuine attraction. Those memories now served as templates for false passion, corrupted into tools of survival. Every sweet moment from her past became ammunition for present deception. Love transformed into treason through necessity. Katherine had learned to fake desire perfectly, but she couldn't fake the one thing Henry demanded above all else: virgin blood from a girl who'd already known love. Catherine Parr stood before her mirror at midnight, practicing facial expressions like an actress preparing for the gallows. Her fingers traced the curve of her lips, adjusting the angle of her smile until it conveyed just enough warmth without suggesting wantonness. The candle flame flickered across her reflection, illuminating features that had already survived one husband's deathbed and now faced something far more treacherous. She tilted her head slightly left, watching how shadows played across her cheekbones, memorizing the exact expression that might save her life tomorrow. The mirror had become her most essential tool of survival. Every morning for the past 3 months, Catherine rose before dawn to rehearse reactions she might need in Henry's bedchamber. A slight widening of the eyes to suggest innocent pleasure, a gentle parting of lips that implied desire without hunger, the delicate balance of breathing that showed arousal without the panting that might mark her as experienced. Each gesture required precision that would shame the finest court performers. Behind her, Mary Odell shifted nervously, holding the tray of cosmetics they used to create Catherine's mask of compliance. The older woman had served 4 queens before this one, and her hands trembled slightly as she watched her mistress practice. They both understood the mathematics of survival in Henry's bed. Too much apparent pleasure suggested a woman who had known other men's touches. Too little marked her as cold, unwilling, possibly treasonous in her lack of enthusiasm for the king's affections. Catherine had studied her predecessors' failures with scholarly intensity. She read trial transcripts by candlelight, noting which responses had condemned Anne Boleyn, which expressions had saved Jane Seymour, until childbirth claimed her. The margin for error narrowed with each queen who fell. Catherine's advantage lay in her age and previous marriage. She could claim mature affection rather than maiden passion, walking a tightrope between experience and innocence. The rehearsals extended beyond facial expressions. Catherine practiced sounds in the privacy of her chambers, learning to modulate her voice to convey various stages of pleasure. Mary would listen with clinical detachment, offering corrections when a moan sounded too theatrical or a gasp came too quickly. They worked like musicians preparing a concert, understanding that one false note could end with Catherine's head on a block. She discovered that breathing patterns mattered as much as sounds. Quick, shallow breaths suggested nervousness that Henry might interpret as guilt. Deep, steady breathing implied calculation rather than passion. Catherine learned to vary her rhythms, matching them to Henry's own laboured respirations, creating a symphony of synchronized desire that existed only in performance. The king's deteriorating health actually helped, his own breathing so irregular that any pattern seemed natural by comparison. Catherine's preparation included physical conditioning that would horrify future generations. She practiced holding uncomfortable positions for extended periods, knowing Henry's limited mobility meant she would bear the burden of their encounters. Her thigh muscles burned from maintaining poses that allowed intimacy while avoiding his suppurating wounds. She learned to distribute her weight carefully, preventing pressure on the parts of him that might rupture or weep. Temperature control became another crucial element. Henry's fever spikes meant his bedchamber often felt like a furnace. Yet Catherine couldn't appear flushed or perspiring in ways that suggested exertion beyond the immediate moment. She trained herself to remain cool under extreme heat, using mental exercises to slow her heart rate even as her body performed its required movements. Ice water baths before each summons helped, though the shock to her system required careful timing. The cosmetic preparations served purposes beyond mere beauty. Catherine and Mary developed a routine using specific powders and creams that wouldn't run or smear under extreme conditions. They tested different formulations during practice sessions, finding combinations that maintained the illusion of desire while her body endured revision. The wrong shade of lip color might suggest arousal that came too easily. Excessive pallor implied fear or disgust. Catherine learned to read Henry's moods through his physical symptoms. Increased swelling in his legs meant heightened irritability that required more enthusiastic responses. Fever dreams made him call her by other names, forcing her to play whatever role his delirium demanded. She kept mental notes of which performances pleased him most, creating a repertoire of reactions tailored to his various states of decay. The preparation extended to her wardrobe. Certain fabrics caught on his bandages, creating painful moments that disrupted the illusion. Others absorbed too readily the fluids that leaked from his wounds, creating stains that reminded him of his condition. Katherine selected materials that glided smoothly over damaged skin while resisting contamination. Each gown was chosen for its ability to be removed quickly without snagging on swollen joints or seeping sores. She discovered that jewelry placement affected her performance capabilities. Heavy necklaces restricted movement and caught on bedclothes. Loose rings slipped off when her hands grew slick with the various substances that accompanied intimate encounters with a decomposing monarch. Katherine learned to wear specific pieces that enhanced her appearance without hindering her ability to maintain the fantasy Henry required. Scent became a weapon in her arsenal of deception. Beyond masking the smell of decay, Katherine used fragrances strategically to trigger Henry's memories of healthier times. She researched which perfumes his previous wives wore during happier periods, recreating those sensory associations. When she wore Anne Boleyn's favourite rose attar, Henry's eyes would glaze with nostalgia that made him gentler, more manageable. The acoustic elements of her performance required special attention. Henry's hearing had deteriorated along with the rest of him, forcing Katherine to project her sounds of pleasure more dramatically than felt natural. She practiced in her chambers with Mary listening from various distances, ensuring her vocalizations carried without sounding forced. The stone walls of the palace created echoes that could distort sound, requiring careful modulation. Katherine developed a system of mental compartmentalization that allowed simultaneous awareness on multiple levels. Part of her mind focused on physical performance, monitoring Henry's responses and adjusting accordingly. Another part maintained the emotional facade, projecting affection and desire through expression and sound. A third part observed from a distance, taking notes for future encounters while calculating how long until she could safely withdraw. These mental gymnastics took their toll. Katherine often emerged from Henry's chambers feeling fractured, as if the different parts of herself struggled to reunite. Mary would find her mistress staring blankly at walls, lips still curved in the practiced smile while tears streamed down carefully powdered cheeks. The recovery process became as choreographed as the performance itself, with specific rituals to restore Katherine's sense of self. She studied anatomy texts to better understand which of Henry's movements might cause catastrophic damage. Knowledge of infection patterns helped her predict when wounds might burst, allowing her to position herself strategically. Katherine learned to recognize the warning signs of tissue about to separate, the slight change in smell that preceded major bleeding. This medical knowledge, acquired through necessity, made her performances more convincing by helping avoid genuine disasters. The line between performance and reality blurred increasingly. Katherine found herself maintaining aspects of her facade even in private moments, the mask becoming harder to remove. She would catch herself practicing expressions while reading, modulating her breathing while walking in gardens. The constant performance created a secondary personality that threatened to overwhelm her authentic self. Henry's demands evolved as his condition worsened, requiring Katherine to adapt her repertoire constantly. What pleased him one week might enrage him the next, his deteriorating mind creating new rules without warning. She learned to read micro-expressions that preceded these shifts, the slight narrowing of eyes that meant her current performance had crossed some invisible line. Flexibility became essential to survival. Katherine discovered that props enhanced her credibility. A strategically placed hand mirror allowed Henry to watch her expressions from angles that flattered his vanity. Silk scarves could hide her face during moments when maintaining the facade became impossible, while appearing to add exotic elements to their encounters. She incorporated these tools seamlessly, making them seem like spontaneous additions rather than calculated survival tactics. The servants who witnessed these performances developed their own coping mechanisms. Some focused intently on their tasks, changing linens and refreshing water basins with mechanical precision. Others learned to anticipate Katherine's needs, providing silent support that helped maintain her facade. An entire network of complicity evolved around the Queen's survival, each person understanding their role in the elaborate deception. Catherine's success, where others had failed, came from treating the performance as a military campaign. She gathered intelligence through servant gossip and physician reports. She planned strategies for different scenarios, wargaming possible encounters in her mind. Every interaction with Henry became a battle where victory meant surviving another day. The martial approach gave her emotional distance from the physical acts required. Documentation added another layer of complexity to Catherine's performances. She knew Henry's physicians recorded details of their encounters, noting frequency, duration, and apparent enthusiasm levels. These reports could become evidence in future trials, forcing Catherine to maintain consistency in her deceptions. She created mental files of each performance, ensuring her reactions aligned with previously documented behavior. Physical conditioning extended beyond holding positions. Catherine exercised specific muscle groups to prevent telltale soreness that might suggest activities beyond the marital bed. She learned to control involuntary responses like flinching or tensing when Henry's infected flesh made contact. Hours spent practicing these controls created muscle memory that activated automatically during actual encounters. The psychological preparation included exposure therapy conducted in private. Catherine would have Mary describe Henry's wounds in graphic detail, while she maintained expressions of affection. They recreated the sounds of his breathing, the smell of his decay, conditioning Catherine to respond with apparent desire rather than revolution. These sessions left both women drained but better prepared for reality. Catherine studied successful courtesans' memoirs, learning techniques for maintaining illusions of desire with unpleasant partners. She adapted their methods to her unique situation, modifying positions to accommodate Henry's limitations while appearing eager and spontaneous. The knowledge that professionals had survived similar challenges gave her hope and practical strategies. Her facial practices evolved to include recovery expressions for afterward. The transition from performed passion to wifely concern required its own choreography, avoiding any suggestion of relief at the encounter's end. Catherine perfected a sequence of expressions that moved from satiation through tenderness to worry about Henry's health, each shift calculated to reinforce her facade of devotion. Sound became her primary tool for maintaining Henry's illusions during moments when visual performance became impossible. She developed a vocabulary of sighs, moans, and whispered endearments that could continue even when her face was hidden or her body positioned awkwardly. These sounds became so practiced that she could produce them while her mind completely dissociated from her body. Catherine survived by becoming the perfect actress. But the game was rigged from the start, because Henry's spies weren't just watching the bedroom anymore. The laundress whispered just 5 words about Katherine Howard's sheets, and within hours, torture instruments were being prepared. Joan Bulmer pressed the Queen's linens against her face, inhaling deeply before dropping them into her washing basket. The fabric carried traces of unfamiliar cologne, masculine and musky, nothing like the King's medicinal scents. Her fingers trembled as she sorted through the bedclothes, finding evidence that would destroy a 19-year-old girl. Those 5 words, she muttered to herself, "This isn't the King's seed," floated through the laundry room's steam like a death sentence taking wing. The other washerwomen continued their work, unaware that Joan had just signed Katherine Howard's death warrant. Wooden paddles slapped wet fabric against stone basins in steady rhythm. Steam rose from cauldrons of boiling water, creating a fog that hid faces but couldn't muffle voices. Joan folded the damning sheets carefully, her movements automatic even as her mind raced. She didn't know that behind a false panel in the wall, a scribe's quill was already moving. Thomas Culpepper's name appeared in the secret ledger before Joan even finished her washing. The hidden observer had recognized the cologne Joan mentioned, matching it to careful notes about courtiers' grooming habits. Every detail mattered in the palace's vast surveillance network. The color of stains, their placement on the sheets, even the way they had dried, all became evidence in neat columns of ink. The scribe worked silently, breathing shallow to avoid detection, recording how a laundress's casual observation would travel up the chain of command. By the time Joan hung the sheets to dry, her words had already reached the first checkpoint. The laundry supervisor, Margaret Morton, listened to the report with practiced calm. She had served 4 queens and understood the weight of bedroom secrets. Margaret's expression never changed as she absorbed the information, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped her counting stick. The protocol was clear. Unusual findings must be reported immediately. Margaret found the castle's under-steward in the buttery, tallying wine casks for the evening meal. She waited until his assistants moved out of earshot before speaking. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing him to lean close. The words she repeated, those 5 fatal words about the sheets, made him set down his ledger with exaggerated care. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, calculating the implications. The under-steward knew his duty, even as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cellar's chill. The information climbed another rung within the hour. The under-steward approached the Lord Chamberlain during the changing of the guard, timing his report for maximum privacy. Soldiers marched past in formation, their synchronized footsteps masking the urgent whispers. The Lord Chamberlain's jaw tightened with each detail. He had daughters Catherine's age, and felt a moment's hesitation before duty overcame sympathy. The machinery of destruction, once set in motion, allowed no room for mercy. Documents began accumulating in locked drawers throughout the palace. Each official who received the report added their own observations, building a case from wisps of gossip. The Lord Chamberlain recalled seeing Catherine dance with Thomas Culpeper at the last feast. Another courtier remembered them laughing together in the garden. Innocent moments transformed into evidence through the alchemy of suspicion. Every smile became a secret signal, every glance a confession of guilt. The gossip network operated on multiple levels simultaneously. While officials documented formal reports, servants whispered in corridors and stairwells. A kitchen maid mentioned overhearing Catherine call out a name in her sleep, not Henry's. A stable boy had seen Culpeper's horse return late one night, mud splattered from a ride that shouldn't have happened. Each fragment of information found its way into the growing collection of proof, though none had witnessed any actual wrongdoing. Lady Rochford played her part with terrifying efficiency. As Catherine's chief lady-in-waiting, she had access to the Queen's most private moments. Her reports included details about Catherine's bathing habits, her correspondence, even the books she read. Lady Rochford noted which poems made the Queen sigh, which songs brought tears to her eyes. Every emotional response was catalogued and analysed for signs of inappropriate attachment. The older woman's own survival depended on proving her vigilance. The network extended beyond the palace walls. Merchants who sold perfume found themselves questioned about their customers' purchases. Seamstresses were asked about alterations to Catherine's gowns. Had she requested lower necklines or tighter bodices? Even the royal physicians contributed, noting changes in the Queen's complexion or appetite that might indicate emotional disturbance. The entire kingdom became a web of surveillance focused on a teenage girl's every move. Francis Derham's name emerged from the investigation's darker corners. Former servants from the Dowager Duchess's household were located and questioned. They spoke of midnight meetings in the maiden's chamber, of Francis calling Catherine his wife before she ever met the king. Old love letters were discovered hidden in forgotten trunks. The investigators pored over faded ink, finding endearments that predated the royal marriage. What had been innocent romance between young people became retroactive treason. The incentive system for informants created a marketplace of betrayal. Servants who provided useful intelligence received extra rations or coveted positions. Those who remained silent faced suspicion themselves. The pressure to contribute something, anything, to the investigation intensified daily. Kitchen boys invented overheard conversations. Chambermaids embellished innocent scenes. The truth became less important than participation in the collective destruction. Mary Lascelles, who had once served Catherine with apparent devotion, provided the most damaging testimony. She recounted private conversations where the Queen had spoken fondly of her life before marriage. Catherine's wistful memories of dancing and music became evidence of a corrupted nature. Mary's reward for this betrayal was a position in the new Queen's household. There would always be a new Queen. The cycle of surveillance and destruction had become self-perpetuating. Physical evidence accumulated alongside testimony. Catherine's jewellery box was searched, revealing a locket with a miniature portrait not of Henry. Her private correspondence was seized and analysed for coded messages. Even her embroidery was examined, searching for hidden meanings in the patterns. Investigators studied the placement of roses and thorns in her needlework, convinced that rebellious thoughts must manifest in every action. The torture instruments mentioned at the beginning weren't meant for Katherine, not yet. They were prepared for her supposed accomplices, the servants and courtiers who might provide final confirmation of guilt. The mere sight of the rack and thumbscrews loosened tongues already inclined to speak. Mark Smeaton's scream still echoed in the tower's memory, reminding everyone what happened to those who resisted interrogation. Most chose to speak before the instruments were even used. The information network operated with bureaucratic efficiency that would impress future police states. Forms were filled in triplicate. Testimonies were cross-referenced and verified. A master ledger tracked every accusation from source to outcome. The system had evolved through 5 previous queens, each investigation refining the process. By Catherine's time, destroying a queen had become routine administrative work. Distance collapsed as the network tightened. Joan Bulmer's 5 words in the laundry reached Thomas Cromwell's desk within 6 hours. He read the report while eating his evening meal, making notes between bites of capon. The machinery he had helped create operated smoothly, without constant oversight. Each person knew their role, understood the rewards for compliance and the consequences of resistance. The surveillance state had achieved self-sustaining momentum. Cromwell summoned his secretary to take dictation. The charges against Katherine would need careful wording to ensure conviction while maintaining legal propriety. Pre-contract with Francis Dereham could invalidate the royal marriage, making subsequent relationships technically not adultery. The legal gymnastics required to transform teenage romance into capital crime would set precedents for centuries. Cromwell's quill scratched steadily, crafting the language that would end a young woman's life. The gathering evidence created its own reality. Servants began remembering things that hadn't happened, influenced by the weight of accumulating testimony. Group psychology transformed suspicious into certainty. Those who expressed doubt found themselves under scrutiny. The safest path was enthusiastic participation in the Queen's destruction. Truth became whatever the majority agreed to remember. Henry received summary reports each morning with his breakfast. His physicians noted how the news affected his health. Increased agitation made his ulcers weep more freely. The king's rage at Catherine's supposed betrayal manifested in physical symptoms that required constant management, yet he demanded every detail, no matter how minor. The gossip network fed his paranoid appetite with steady streams of information, each report stoking his fury higher. The surveillance system's true genius lay in its ability to make everyone complicit. From laundresses to lords, each person who passed along information became invested in its truth. Admitting doubt after contributing to the investigation meant admitting participation in potential murder. The network protected itself by ensuring no one could claim innocence. Everyone's hands were stained with invisible blood. Katherine remained unaware of the closing net for several more days. She continued her routines, smiled at courtiers who were secretly testifying against her, was served by ladies who documented her every word. The normalcy of her daily life, while destruction gathered around her, added another layer of horror to the process. She practiced music, while her music teacher provided evidence. She prayed while her confessor violated sacred trust. The gossip network had found what Henry wanted: proof that his teenage queen had a past, and in Henry's England, having a past was a death sentence. The prosecutor held up a love letter Katherine Howard had written at age 13, before she'd ever heard Henry's name. The parchment crackled between his fingers as morning light from the tower's narrow windows illuminated faded ink. Words of innocent affection, written in a young girl's careful script, transformed into evidence of corruption before the assembled court. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her own handwriting, remembering the summer afternoon when she'd penned those lines to Francis Dereham, never imagining they would someday seal her fate. The transformation of past into present crime required legal contortions that made even experienced lawyers uncomfortable. Katherine watched the prosecutor's face twist with manufactured outrage as he read aloud promises she'd made as a child. Each endearment became proof of her lustful nature, every declaration of young love, evidence of a pattern that threatened the crown. The court scribe's quills scratched frantically, recording how prosecutors built treason from memories of stolen kisses in garden shadows. Francis Derham sat in chains across the courtroom, his face gaunt from weeks in the Tower. Their eyes met for one terrible moment before guards forced his head down. The boy who'd once brought her wildflowers had aged decades in captivity, his romantic bravado crushed by iron and stone. Katherine remembered his gentle hands teaching her to dance, now bloodied from shackles that marked him as a traitor for loving a girl who would become queen. The legal precedent being established sent tremors through every marriage in England. If relationships before royal wedding vows could become retroactive adultery, then every person's romantic history transformed into potential treason. Lawyers in the gallery exchanged worried glances as they grasped the implications. The prosecutor continued reading Katherine's letters, his voice rising with each passage, painting natural affection as unnatural corruption. Lady Rochford's testimony came next, her words measured and deadly. She described finding Katherine's hidden cache of letters from before her marriage, speaking as if discovery of teenage correspondence constituted uncovering enemy intelligence. The older woman's voice never wavered as she recounted conversations where Katherine had mentioned Francis with fondness. Each memory shared in confidence became another stone in the wall building around the young queen. The prosecutor produced more evidence with theatrical timing. A ring Francis had given Katherine years ago, discovered in her jewellery box. Testimony from servants who remembered seeing them walk together in the Dowager Duchess's gardens. Dancing lessons that lasted past appropriate hours. Every innocent moment of youth reframed through the lens of royal paranoia. The accumulated weight of normalcy, when viewed through suspicion's filter, created an avalanche of guilt. Katherine's hands gripped the wooden rail before her until splinters pressed into her palms. She wanted to scream that she'd been 13, barely more than a child when Francis first smiled at her across a crowded hall. The words lodged in her throat as lawyers twisted time itself, making her accountable for feelings that predated her knowledge of Henry's existence. The law bent and warped to accommodate royal rage, turning yesterday's innocence into today's damnation. Thomas Culpeper's name entered testimony like poison, spreading through water. The prosecutor's voice dropped to dramatic whispers as he described secret meetings, though no witness could place them together inappropriately. Speculation filled the gaps where evidence failed. Katherine's friendly conversation with a courtier became clandestine assignations. Her request that he deliver a message transformed into coded communication between lovers. The truth mattered less than the narrative being constructed. Francis began to speak when prompted, his voice cracked from screaming. The words that emerged weren't his own, but those dictated by interrogators who knew what needed saying. He called Katherine his wife, explaining their pre-contract invalidated her marriage to Henry. The admission meant death for him, but offered her the slim possibility of annulment rather than execution. Katherine bit through her lip, watching him sacrifice himself with lies designed to save her. The methodology of retroactive criminalization revealed itself through each witness. Servants who'd attended the Dowager Duchess spoke of communal sleeping arrangements where young people shared chambers. Normal practices of gentry households became evidence of moral laxity. The prosecutor painted pictures of midnight revelry where reality had held only giggling teenagers sharing gossip and sweetmeats after dark. Time collapsed as past and present merged into an indictment of Katherine's entire existence. More letters appeared, these from Thomas Culpeper to Katherine after her marriage. The prosecution read them with emphasis on every endearment, though the actual words spoke only of courtly admiration. Poems comparing her beauty to roses became declarations of carnal desire. Requests to wear her favour at tournaments transformed into admissions of adultery. The interpretation mattered more than content, as lawyers built their case from implications and assumptions. Katherine recognised the game being played even as she remained powerless to stop it. Her past was being rewritten in real time, edited to fit the narrative of a dissolute woman who'd deceived a king. The sweet memories of first love curdled as prosecutors poured their poison over them. Francis Derham became not a boy who'd made her laugh, but a predator who'd corrupted her innocence. Their innocent romance transformed into the prologue of her supposed degeneracy. Witnesses described the layout of the maiden's chamber at the Dowager Duchess's estate, drawing diagrams that made communal living seem like organised debauchery. The prosecutor held up architectural sketches, pointing to alcoves where young women had slept, his finger tracing paths between beds as if marking routes of corruption. Katherine remembered those rooms filled with whispered confidences and shared dreams, now mapped like crime scenes in meticulous detail. The legal arguments grew increasingly tortuous as prosecutors struggled to make premarital affection into postmarital treason. They cited obscure precedents, twisted canonical law, invented interpretations that would have horrified legal scholars in any other context. The judge nodded along, his verdict predetermined, needing only the thinnest veneer of legitimacy. Justice had become theatre, and everyone knew their roles. Francis tried to recant portions of his testimony, realizing too late that his admissions condemned them both. Guards struck him silent before he could speak truths that contradicted the official narrative. Blood ran from his mouth as he slumped in his chains, the sight making Katherine's stomach clench. She understood then that guilt or innocence meant nothing in this courtroom, where verdicts preceded evidence. The accumulation of transformed memories created its own momentum, each piece of testimony built upon previous distortions until the fabricated structure seemed solid through sheer weight. Servants who'd initially reported innocent observations found their words twisted into confirmations of guilt. The machine of prosecution ground forward, crushing truth beneath wheels of predetermined conclusion. Katherine's youth became evidence against her rather than mitigation. The prosecutor argued that her early romantic experiences proved a pattern of deception, that she'd entered marriage with practiced skills in dissimulation. Her ability to hide past affections demonstrated criminal cunning rather than natural discretion. Every quality that might inspire sympathy, inverted into proof of guilt through legal alchemy. The presentation reached its climax with evidence of Katherine's meetings with Culpeper after marriage. Though no witness could testify to impropriety, the mere fact of private conversation became sufficient for condemnation. The prosecutor painted word pictures of secret trysts, his imagination filling spaces where evidence failed. Katherine watched him construct her adultery from air and assumption, building a scaffold of words that would soon become literal. Time distorted further, as prosecutors compressed years into moments and expanded moments into eternities. A glance that lasted seconds became a prolonged communication of desire. Months of innocent friendship compressed into a single narrative of inevitable corruption. The timeline of Katherine's life rearranged itself to support conclusions drawn before investigation began. The show trial's predetermined nature revealed itself in small details. Scribes had verdicts partially written before testimony concluded. The judge's expressions never changed regardless of evidence presented. Even Katherine's defenders spoke with the resignation of actors in predetermined roles. Everyone understood they were participating in theatre where the final act was already written. Physical evidence underwent similar transformation. Katherine's needlework, depicting spring flowers and young lovers from mythology, became proof of lustful preoccupations. Books of poetry in her chambers showed intellectual corruption. Even her prayers, recorded by confessors who'd violated sacred trust, were passed for hidden meanings. Nothing remained innocent once passed through the prosecution's interpretive machinery. The moving goalposts of sexual crimes became explicit as prosecutors argued their case. What constituted adultery expanded to include emotional attachment, past relationships, even the potential for future affection. The definition stretched until it encompassed any connection between men and women, not explicitly sanctioned by royal approval. Katherine realized that every woman in England had become vulnerable to similar accusations. Francis made one final attempt to speak truth before they dragged him away. His words came out garbled through broken teeth, but Katherine understood his message of love and regret. The boy who'd taught her to dance would die for having loved her before she became royal property. Their innocent past had been transformed into present treason through the alchemy of power and paranoia. Katherine's defenders made their futile arguments, knowing the outcome while maintaining legal proprieties. They spoke of youth and inexperience, of natural affections misconstrued, of the impossibility of retroactive adultery. The judge dismissed each point with practiced indifference. The forms of justice required opposition even when conclusion remained fixed. Everyone played their parts in the elaborate performance of predetermined guilt. The prosecutor's closing arguments painted Catherine as a deceiver from childhood, her entire life a preparation for betraying the king. He transformed her from a teenage girl who'd known innocent love into a calculated seductress who'd planned her corruption from the beginning. The narrative required her to be simultaneously naive enough to be corrupted and cunning enough to hide that corruption. Logic bent until it broke, but breaking logic mattered less than satisfying royal rage. Catherine finally understood the trap completely. Her past had been rewritten to guarantee her future would end on the scaffold. The love she'd known before Henry became the weapon that would destroy her. Every sweet memory transformed into evidence of guilt through the terrible machinery of royal justice. The prosecutor held up another letter, this one signed with her pet name for Francis, and Catherine knew that young love had become old death. The verdict arrived with mechanical precision, surprising no one. Guilty of adultery through pre-contract, guilty of adultery through imagination, guilty of concealing past affections from the king. The charges multiplied like cancer cells, each building on the last until the weight of manufactured guilt pressed down like physical force. Catherine stood as they read the sentence, her spine straight despite knowing what came next. As guards prepared to return her to the tower, Catherine caught sight of Francis being dragged to his own fate. Their eyes met one final time across the courtroom. In that glance lived all the summer afternoons and stolen kisses that had brought them to this moment. The innocent love of children transformed into the death warrant of adults through the terrible alchemy of power. Catherine looked away first, knowing that remembering his living face would be harder than imagining it cold. The legal precedent set by her trial would echo through centuries. Past affections became present dangers. Previous relationships transformed into future treasons. The moving goalposts of sexual crimes had found their ultimate expression in the principle that love itself could be criminalized retroactively. Katherine Howard's true crime wasn't adultery, but the audacity of having lived and loved before becoming royal property. They led her back to her cell to await the final act of this carefully orchestrated tragedy. Behind her, scribes filed away the trial records that would stand as testament to how love became treason in Henry's England. The transformation was complete. A 13-year-old's love letter had become a 19-year-old's death warrant. Catherine's past had been rewritten as treason, but the true horror was yet to come, because Henry had special plans for how a teenage adulteress should die. The physician's hands trembled as he guided the wooden crane's ropes into position above Henry's bed. Each pulley squeaked with rust and strain, the sound sharp in the midnight silence of the royal chamber. 6 servants stood at their assigned posts, faces carefully blank as they prepared to maneuver their sovereign into position for his wedding night with Catherine Parr. The lead servant counted under his breath, synchronizing their movements as they'd practiced dozens of times on sacks of grain that weighed far less than their king. The mechanical apparatus stretched across the ceiling like a spider's web of rope and metal. Iron hooks had been driven deep into ancient beams, tested to hold 500 pounds without giving way. The servants' breathing fell into rhythm as they began their work. Canvas straps slipped beneath Henry's massive form, the fabric already stained from previous uses. Each man knew his role in this grotesque ballet of bodies and machinery. Catherine Parr stood at the chamber's edge, her face composed despite the horror unfolding before her. She watched the servants strain against the ropes, their muscles bulging as they lifted Henry's lower body into the required angle. The king's breathing grew laboured with the change in position. Sweat beaded on the servants' foreheads as they fought to maintain steady tension on the lines. One wrong move could tear already fragile skin or reopen wounds that never truly healed. The positioning process took 43 minutes of careful adjustment. Each shift required coordination between the 6 men, their movements choreographed through painful experience. The youngest servant gagged when a bandage slipped, revealing the horror beneath. His partner kicked him sharply, a reminder that showing disgust meant dismissal or worse. They continued their work in silence, broken only by rope against wood and Henry's increasingly agitated breathing. Catherine approached when summoned, her silk nightgown whispering against the floor. The servants averted their eyes as she climbed onto the specially reinforced bed, its frame groaning despite additional supports. She positioned herself according to the chalk marks drawn on the sheets, guidelines that ensured her safety while accommodating the king's limitations. The mechanical nature of the process stripped away any pretense of romance or desire, but the machinery served darker purposes than mere positioning. The ropes allowed Henry to maintain dominance despite his physical decay. He could direct the servants to adjust angles that caused Catherine discomfort while protecting his own wounds. The power dynamic remained intact even as his body failed. She learned to anticipate which commands meant pain was coming, reading the subtle shifts in rope tension like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. The servants developed their own language of glances and gestures, communicating silently while their hands worked the ropes. They had witnessed horrors that bonded them in shared trauma. The man controlling the left posterior rope had seen Jane Seymour's face when the mechanism failed during her final encounter with Henry. Another remembered Anne of Cleves vomiting when a particularly violent adjustment caused Henry's wound to burst. These memories passed between them in the lift of an eyebrow, the tightening of a jaw. Catherine discovered that the apparatus included features she hadn't initially noticed. Small mirrors had been positioned to allow Henry to observe from angles his immobility would otherwise prevent. The violation of being watched while machinery held her in place added psychological torment to physical discomfort. She kept her expression carefully neutral, knowing that any sign of revulsion would be reported and analyzed. The ropes created their own sounds that haunted the servants' dreams. The creaking of hemp against wood became synonymous with royal knights. Some servants reported hearing phantom pulley sounds in their own chambers, their bodies tensing automatically, as if preparing to take their positions. The mechanical sounds had embedded themselves so deeply that men flinched at similar noises in everyday life. Henry's commands came in gasps between laboured breaths. Higher on the left meant increasing pressure on Catherine's spine. Tighten the centre, forced her into positions that made breathing difficult. The servants obeyed without hesitation, their faces masks of professional detachment. They had learned to disconnect from the humanity of what they were doing, becoming extensions of the machinery itself. Then came the night when the unthinkable happened. The main support rope, weakened by months of strain and bodily fluids, began to fray during a particularly vigorous adjustment. The servants heard it first, that distinctive sound of hemp fibers separating under tension. The man holding the guide rope locked eyes with his partner across the bed. They both knew what would happen if the rope snapped completely. 400 pounds of diseased flesh would crash down, likely crushing the queen beneath. Working with desperate efficiency, two servants scrambled to thread a backup rope through the secondary pulley system. Their hands shook as they tied knots strong enough to hold but quick enough to complete before disaster struck. Catherine remained perfectly still, understanding that any movement might accelerate the rope's failure. Henry, lost in his own world of pain and pleasure, remained oblivious to the drama playing out above him. The fraying accelerated with a sound like tearing silk. One servant abandoned his position to grab the emergency rope, muscles straining as he took the king's full weight manually. His arms shook with effort while others worked to secure the backup system. 30 seconds stretched into eternity as they fought against gravity and time. The original rope, held by mere threads, each fibre that snapped bringing catastrophe closer. They secured the backup system just as the main rope gave way entirely. The sudden shift jarred Henry from his reverie, causing him to cry out in pain as wounds reopened from the motion. Fresh blood seeped through bandages while servants scrambled to restabilize the system. Catherine bit through her lip to keep from screaming as the king's full weight pressed down momentarily before the new ropes took hold. The mechanical failure required explanation, but the servants who reported it carefully omitted Catherine's presence from their account. They spoke only of testing the equipment when the rope failed, maintaining the fiction that such failures never occurred during actual use. The king ordered new ropes of double thickness, caring more about his continued access than the near catastrophe that could have killed his queen. Catherine learned to read the rope conditions like a map of future dangers. Fresh hemp meant a night of precise positioning but relative safety. Worn fibers suggested unpredictability that required constant vigilance. She developed an engineer's eye for stress points and weight distribution, survival skills that no queen should need but all of Henry's wives eventually acquired. The servants responsible for maintaining the apparatus carried that burden beyond their palace duties, They checked and rechecked every component, knowing that mechanical failure meant personal failure with fatal consequences. One man spent his own wages on higher quality rope, unable to bear the thought of another near disaster. The machinery had made them all complicit in a system that transformed intimacy into engineering. The dehumanization affected everyone involved, but none more than Henry himself. He had become a problem to be solved with ropes and pulleys, rather than a person capable of genuine connection. The machinery that enabled his desires also reduced him to cargo being maneuvered into position. Yet he seemed unaware of this transformation, focusing only on the power the system gave him over his young wife's body. Katherine developed her own relationship with the apparatus over months of use. She learned which ropes controlled which movements, anticipating adjustments before commands were given. This knowledge allowed her to position herself in ways that minimized discomfort while maintaining the illusion of compliance. The machinery became her teacher in the physics of survival. Some nights, the system required repairs mid-encounter. Servants would freeze in position, holding ropes manually, while others made adjustments. These moments of suspended animation felt surreal, humans becoming part of the machinery while their king remained focused on his pleasure. Katherine learned to maintain her facade even during these mechanical interludes, her performance continuing regardless of technical difficulties. The psychological weight of operating the machinery broke some servants. They requested transfers to other duties, unable to continue participating in the mechanical horror. Others developed nervous conditions, their hands shaking too badly to maintain steady rope control. The turnover rate for bedchamber servants exceeded all other palace positions, though the official records never stated why. But the pulleys weren't the most disturbing part. The true horror lay in how routine it had become. Servants arrived at appointed times with the same detachment as stable boys mucking stalls. They prepared their ropes and checked their pulleys with professional efficiency. The extraordinary had become ordinary through repetition, mechanical manipulation of human bodies reduced to another palace chore. Even Katherine found herself thinking in terms of angles and tensions rather than the reality of what was happening. The apparatus expanded over time as Henry's condition worsened. New pulleys appeared to accommodate different positions. Additional support beams were installed to handle increased weight from swelling. The mechanical web grew more complex with each modification, turning the royal bedchamber into something resembling a torture chamber designed for peculiar intimacies. Visiting dignitaries sometimes glimpsed the apparatus during daytime tours, though guides quickly ushered them past with vague explanations about medical equipment. Those who understood its true purpose shared knowing looks but never spoke openly about what they'd seen. The mechanical horror had become an open secret, acknowledged through silence and averted eyes. The sounds of the machinery carried through palace walls on quiet nights. Other courtiers learned to recognize the rhythm of ropes and pulleys, timing their own activities to avoid proximity to the royal bedchamber during use. The mechanical sounds became a warning system, alerting the palace to avoid certain corridors at certain hours. Even hardened soldiers chose alternate routes rather than risk hearing what those sounds accompanied. Katherine's survival depended on becoming part of the machinery herself. She learned to move with the ropes rather than against them, flowing like water through the positions they created. Her body became an extension of the apparatus, responding to mechanical cues with practiced precision. The dehumanization that broke other queens became her shield against the horror. The servants developed superstitions around the machinery over time. They believed certain knots brought bad luck, that ropes tied counterclockwise caused accidents. These beliefs gave them an illusion of control over an uncontrollable situation. They whispered prayers while preparing the apparatus, seeking divine protection from mechanical failure and royal wrath. Documentation of the machinery remained deliberately vague in official records. Physicians noted only that assistive devices were employed to accommodate the king's condition. The specific details of ropes and pulleys and human cargo never appeared in writing. The mechanical horror existed in a space between acknowledgement and denial, too real to ignore but too terrible to record. What the servants saw that night broke even hardened men. One young man fled the palace entirely after witnessing a particularly grotesque mechanical failure. The rope controlling Henry's midsection had slipped, causing his massive weight to fold in ways that revealed the full extent of his decay. The sound his body made, flesh separating from flesh under mechanical strain, sent two servants running for buckets to vomit in. They saw what remained of their king's humanity crushed beneath the weight of his own mechanical appetites. The apparatus required constant innovation. As Henry's body continued its rebellion against life, physicians designed new attachments to protect increasingly fragile skin. Engineers reinforced beams as his weight climbed beyond original calculations. Each modification reminded everyone involved that they were maintaining machinery designed to enable a dying man's delusions of virility. Katherine learned to use the mechanical sounds to mask her own responses. The creaking of ropes covered involuntary gasps of disgust. The squeak of pulleys drowned out sounds of pain when positions became unbearable. She choreographed her performance to the machinery's rhythm, finding spaces within mechanical noise to hide her humanity. The servants who operated the ropes aged rapidly under the strain. Young men developed bent backs from hours of holding tension. Their hands became gnarled from gripping rough hemp night after night. They bore physical marks of their service, bodies shaped by the machinery they operated. Some found they could no longer perform normal tasks, their muscles trained only for the specific pulls and tensions of the royal apparatus. Henry ordered modifications based on whims that revealed his deteriorating mental state. He wanted mirrors that moved on tracks, ropes that could create positions defying physics, pulleys that would somehow restore his lost youth. The engineers nodded and made adjustments that satisfied his demands without acknowledging their impossibility. The machinery evolved to match its master's delusions. The dismantling of the apparatus after each use required as much coordination as its operation. Servants worked in practiced silence, coiling ropes and storing components in locked chambers. They cleaned evidence of the night's activities with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to its operation. Some developed compulsive cleaning behaviors, scrubbing their hands raw, trying to remove stains that existed more in memory than reality. Katherine survived by studying the machinery with the dedication of a scholar. She memorized weight ratios and stress tolerances, understanding the physics that governed her torment. This knowledge gave her power within powerlessness, allowing her to work with the system rather than merely endure it. She became an engineer of her own survival. And then the unthinkable happened again, but this time with deadly consequences. During what would be one of the final sessions, a critical support beam cracked without warning. The sound split the air like thunder, causing every servant to freeze in position. They held their ropes as the beam above them splintered, showering the bed with wooden fragments. Katherine rolled aside just as a massive section crashed down where she'd been positioned moments before. The collapse brought down portions of the apparatus, ropes and pulleys cascading onto the bed in a tangle of hemp and metal. Henry screamed as the sudden loss of support sent shockwaves through his infected body. Wounds that had been carefully positioned tore open, releasing fluids that soaked instantly through his nightclothes. The mechanical system that had enabled his desires finally betrayed him completely. Servants scrambled to extract their king from the wreckage, while Katherine pressed herself against the wall, forgotten in the chaos. They cut through ropes with belt knives, lifting wooden beams that had pinned Henry's legs. His screams echoed through the palace, as movement aggravated every infection. The machinery meant to give him power had nearly killed him instead. The collapse marked the end of the mechanical horror, though not the end of Henry's demands. Physicians forbade reconstruction, claiming the king's wounds couldn't withstand further mechanical manipulation. Katherine felt a guilty relief watching servants dismantle the apparatus piece by piece. Each rope removed felt like a small liberation from the dehumanizing system. Yet the memory of the machinery lingered in the bedchamber even after its physical removal. Marks on the ceiling showed where pulleys had hung. Gouges in beams revealed stress points from 400 pounds of royal flesh. The room itself bore scars from the mechanical horror it had contained. Architectural trauma that matched the human trauma it had witnessed. Katherine Parr survived where others hadn't, by becoming the perfect mechanical queen. She learned to operate within systems designed to destroy humanity, maintaining enough of herself to endure while adapting to mechanical demands. Her survival came at the cost of participating in her own dehumanization, becoming complicit in the very system that oppressed her. The servants who had operated the machinery dispersed throughout the palace, carrying their knowledge like guilty secrets. They recognized each other by subtle signs, men who'd shared in mechanical horror beyond normal palace service. Some drank heavily to forget the sounds of ropes and flesh. Others found they could never again tie knots without remembering what those knots had enabled. The mechanical king had created mechanical queens, but for young Katherine Howard, no amount of machinery could save her from the one device that mattered, the executioner's block. The tower guard later swore he heard Katherine Howard practicing her final words 100 times that night. The stone walls echoed with her whispered rehearsals, each repetition growing steadier as dawn approached. She knelt beside the narrow window where February wind cut through iron bars, her lips moving in silent prayer between each practice run. The guard counted under his breath, tallying her attempts like a merchant counting coins, wondering if any amount of preparation could ready someone for what morning would bring. Katherine rose from her knees with deliberate grace, smoothing the black velvet of her gown. The fabric whispered against stone as she crossed to the small table where her final meal sat untouched. Her fingers traced the rim of a pewter cup filled with wine she wouldn't drink. Outside her cell door, boots shuffled on stone as guards changed their watch, the metallic clink of weapons marking time toward her fate. She had requested the block 3 hours earlier. The lieutenant of the tower himself had carried it to her cell, his face pale as he set the wooden instrument on the floor. Katherine thanked him with the same courtesy she'd shown at court banquets, her voice never betraying the terror that clawed at her throat. The block sat there now, innocent-looking in candlelight, just a carved piece of oak that would soon cradle her neck. The first practice attempt made her hands shake so violently she could barely position herself. Katherine approached the block as she might approach a sleeping serpent, each movement calculated to avoid awakening something terrible. Her knees found the grooves worn smooth by others who'd knelt here before. The wood felt cold against her palms as she leaned forward, testing the angle required. Her neck didn't fit properly at first. The curve of the block seemed designed for someone taller, forcing her chin too far forward. Katherine adjusted her position, shifting weight from knee to knee until she found the precise placement. Her hair fell forward like a curtain, and she realized with sudden clarity that she'd need to move it aside tomorrow. Another detail to remember when remembering became impossible. The second attempt went smoother. Katherine had removed her hood to better judge distances, letting auburn hair spill loose around her shoulders. She practiced gathering the strands with one hand, twisting them aside in a motion that looked almost casual. The guards outside had stopped their quiet conversation, and she knew they were listening to silk rustle against wood as she refined her movements. Katherine wasn't the first queen to practice dying in this cell. The walls themselves held memories of Anne Boleyn's similar rehearsals, though Katherine tried not to think about her cousin's fate. The same stones had witnessed Jane Seymour's fevered preparations, practicing even as childbirth fever consumed her. Each queen had knelt where Katherine knelt now, learning the terrible choreography of royal execution. She whispered her planned final words between attempts, testing how they felt on her tongue. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The sentence had seemed romantic when she'd first conceived it, but now the words tasted like ash. Katherine tried variations, adjusting emphasis and tone, wondering if anyone would even hear her over the crowd's roar. The guard outside coughed, reminding her that every word already had an audience. By the 10th attempt, muscle memory began to form. Katherine's body learned the exact number of steps from door to block, the precise angle of approach that would look dignified rather than desperate. She practiced breathing exercises Mary Lascelles had taught her for managing fear, though Mary herself now awaited execution in another cell. The betrayal still burned, but Katherine found herself grateful for the techniques that kept her lungs steady. The candle burned lower with each repetition. Wax pooled on the iron holder, forming shapes that resembled frozen tears. Katherine counted the drips between practices, using their rhythm to pace her movements. She discovered that moving too quickly looked like eagerness for death, while too slowly suggested the cowardice that gave crowds satisfaction. The balance required theatrical precision. Her 20th attempt achieved something close to grace. Katherine moved from standing to kneeling in one fluid motion, her hands finding their position without hesitation. The angle of her neck felt almost natural now, though nothing about placing one's head on a block could truly feel natural. She held the position longer this time, imagining the weight of waiting for the axe to fall. The priest arrived near midnight, his robes rustling like dead leaves. Father John carried communion wine and wafers, though Catherine's throat had closed too tightly to swallow. She made her final confession kneeling beside the block, finding dark comedy in the positioning. The priest's hands trembled as he offered absolution for loving the wrong men at the wrong times. What she whispered to the priest would haunt him forever. Catherine spoke not of sin, but of the mechanical horrors she'd endured in Henry's bed, the ropes and pulleys and putrid flesh she'd navigated to survive. She described practicing false desire the way she now practiced dying, both performances required by a king who turned women into actresses. The priest's face went grey as she detailed survival strategies no 19-year-old should know. Catherine asked if God would forgive her for the lies she'd told with her body. The priest stammered through theological explanations about duress and innocence, but his words rang hollow in that stone cell. She pressed him for honesty, and finally he admitted he didn't know if heaven had room for women who'd faked love to avoid the block. The uncertainty felt more honest than comfort. After the priest left, Catherine returned to her practice with renewed determination. She had confessed her earthly sins, and now only the physical act remained. The movements came easier as exhaustion numbed her fear. Her body learned to betray her one final time, cooperating with its own destruction through repetition. The 50th attempt felt different. Catherine realized she'd stopped counting steps, stopped measuring angles. Her body moved automatically from door to block, assuming the position without conscious thought. The terrible freedom of muscle memory meant her mind could wander, while her flesh performed its final role. She thought of summer afternoons before she'd known Henry's name, when love meant stolen kisses instead of state treason. Dawn crept through the barred window like a grey thief. Catherine had lost count of her rehearsals, though the guard outside would later swear to exactly 100. Her knees bore bruises from hours of practice, dark marks hidden beneath velvet skirts. She wondered if the executioner would notice how easily she found her position, if he'd realized she'd spent the night preparing for his work. The tower bells began their morning toll. Catherine rose from what would be her final practice, her movements still fluid despite exhaustion. She had perfected the art of approaching death with dignity, transformed her terror into choreographed calm. The block remained on the floor, patient as stone, waiting for their last performance together. She dressed with particular care, choosing jewellery that wouldn't interfere with the axe's path. Catherine pinned her hair high, exposing the neck she'd spent all night learning to position. Her ladies would normally help with such preparations, but she'd sent them away, unwilling to share these final intimate moments with women who'd testified against her. The mirror showed a 19-year-old girl who looked decades older. Catherine studied her reflection, wondering if Francis Derham would recognize the woman royal marriage had made her. The innocent girl who'd loved him had died months ago in Henry's bed, crushed beneath mechanical horrors and putrid flesh. What remained was an actress preparing for her final performance. Guards arrived as the 7th bell tolled. Catherine stood ready, her practice evident in the graceful way she extended her wrists for binding. She'd rehearsed this too, knowing that struggling would only provide entertainment for the crowd already gathering on Tower Green. The rope felt lighter than the chains of queenship she'd worn for 2 years. The walk from cell to scaffold usually took 10 minutes. Catherine had timed it during her rehearsals, pacing her cell to match the distance. She moved now with measured steps, neither rushing toward death nor delaying the inevitable. Each footfall echoed with practiced precision through stone corridors that had witnessed this procession before. She could hear the crowd before she saw them. The Tower Green writhed with spectators come to watch a teenager die for the crime of having loved before marriage. Catherine's step never faltered, though bile rose in her throat. She had practiced for an audience of stone walls and now faced a sea of living faces eager for her blood. The scaffold loomed like a wooden stage set for tragedy. Catherine noticed details she'd tried to imagine during her rehearsals. The worn steps where other queens had climbed, the straw spread to absorb what would come. The block itself sat precisely where she'd expected, its position burned into her memory through repetition. The executioner waited with professional patience. His black hood made him anonymous, though Katherine wondered if he'd wielded the axe for her cousin Anne. She met what she assumed were his eyes, nodding slight acknowledgement of their shared purpose. He had work to do, and she'd spent all night learning to help him do it. The crowd fell silent as Katherine climbed the scaffold stairs. Her practiced grace held despite legs that wanted to buckle, muscle memory, overriding terror. She reached the platform and turned to face the sea of faces, finding her mark like an actress who'd rehearsed her entrance. The morning wind caught her velvet gown, making it billow like black wings. Katherine delivered her final speech with the same precision she'd practiced her movements. The words came smoothly despite her dry throat, each phrase landing with rehearsed emphasis. She spoke of loving wrongly but not falsely, of dying for the crime of a heart that loved before it knew it would wear a crown. Some in the crowd wept at her composure, not knowing she'd paid for it with a night of terrible practice. And then came the moment she'd rehearsed 100 times. Katherine moved toward the block with fluid grace, each step exactly as practiced. Her hands found their positions without hesitation. She gathered her hair with the same motion she'd perfected in darkness, twisting auburn strands aside to bare her neck. The crowd gasped at her ease with death's furniture, not understanding they witnessed the culmination of a night's desperate rehearsal. As dawn broke over the tower, Katherine Howard rose from her knees, having perfected the angle of her neck. She was ready to join the ghosts of Henry's bedroom, where love had become law, and law had become death. Dawn light crept through the tower's narrow windows as Katherine Howard walked her final path, each footstep echoing with the precision she'd rehearsed through the night. The stone corridor stretched before her like a throat waiting to swallow, guards flanking her progress with downcast eyes. Her black velvet gown whispered against the floor, the sound mixing with distant church bells that marked her final hour. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd practiced this walk in darkness, counting steps that would never need counting again. The crowd's murmur reached her before she stepped into morning air, thousands of voices blending into a sound like wind through dead leaves. Katherine's breath came steady and measured, the breathing exercises serving her one last time. The scaffold rose from Tower Green like a wooden altar to justice, its fresh-cut pine smell sharp against February's chill. Her practiced eye found the block immediately, positioned exactly where her midnight rehearsals had taught her to expect it. The executioner stood motionless in his black hood, axe resting against his thigh with casual familiarity. Katherine met his hidden gaze and nodded, acknowledging their grim appointment. The crowd pressed closer as she climbed the scaffold steps, her movements betraying none of the terror that clawed inside her chest. Each step upward felt like ascending a stage for her final performance, the role she'd rehearsed until her knees bore bruises beneath her gown. She turned to face the sea of upturned faces, finding her mark on the platform with theatrical precision. The wind caught her carefully pinned hair, loosening strands that would soon matter not at all. Katherine's voice rang clear across the green as she delivered her prepared speech, each word landing with the weight of practice. She spoke of love and law, of hearts that knew no timing, of dying a queen when she'd rather die a wife. The crowd stirred at her composure, not knowing they witnessed the result of 100 repetitions in darkness. Some wept openly at this 19-year-old's dignity, others leaned forward with hungry eyes. Katherine felt their gaze like physical weight but maintained the calm she'd paid for with a sleepless night. The speech ended as rehearsed, her final words floating across the green like leaves on water. The moment had arrived for her last performance, the one she'd practiced until muscle memory overcame terror. Katherine moved toward the block with liquid grace, her body remembering every angle she'd perfected. The crowd gasped at how easily she knelt, how naturally her hands found their positions on the cold wood. She gathered her auburn hair with one smooth motion, twisting it aside to bare her neck, just as she'd rehearsed. The executioner stepped forward, his boots crushing straw with sounds like breaking bones. Katherine held her practiced position, chin tilted at the exact angle she'd memorized. Her breathing remained steady even as the axe rose, catching morning light on its polished edge. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the moment when practice would meet reality. The blade fell with a whisper of displaced air, and Katherine Howard's rehearsals ended forever. Her body performed its final act with the same grace she'd practiced, collapsing forward exactly as gravity demanded. Blood spread across the scaffold's fresh wood, seeping into grain that had absorbed such offerings before. The crowd released its breath in a sound like wind through an empty house. The executioner stepped back, his work complete with professional efficiency. Catherine's head rolled slightly on the bloodied straw, auburn hair spreading like spilled wine. Her eyes remained open, fixed on some point beyond the scaffold's edge. The practiced dignity of her final moments lingered in the air like perfume after the wearer has gone. Guards moved forward to collect what remained, their movements mechanical with repetition. They wrapped Catherine's body in rough cloth, hiding the black velvet now ruined beyond repair. Her head received separate treatment, lifted carefully into a basket lined with more straw. The efficiency spoke of routine, another queen processed through the tower's terrible machinery. The crowd began to disperse, their bloodlust satisfied by the morning's entertainment. Some crossed themselves and hurried away, others lingered to discuss the executed queen's remarkable composure. None knew of the midnight rehearsals that had purchased that dignity, the 100 practice runs that had transformed terror into choreography. They'd witnessed the final performance without understanding the desperate preparation behind it. Blood dripped steadily through the scaffold boards, creating patterns in the dirt below. The executioner cleaned his axe with practiced motions, preparing it for future use. Tower guards cleared the platform with brooms and buckets, erasing Katherine Howard from the space she'd commanded moments before. By noon, fresh straw would cover the stains, ready for the next performance on this wooden stage. Word of Catherine's execution reached Henry before his morning physicians arrived. The king received the news in bed, propped against pillows that barely contained his massive form. His expression remained unreadable as messengers described his fifth wife's final moments. The ulcers on his legs wept steadily, marking his sheets with stains that servants would burn before nightfall. Henry ordered his secretaries to begin searching for a sixth wife before Catherine's blood had dried. The machinery of royal marriage would continue its grinding progress, seeking another young woman to fill the role. The bedroom rules that had destroyed 5 queens remained unchanged, waiting to ensnare whoever next caught the king's attention. Fresh eyes would watch through walls, new servants would operate ropes and pulleys, another woman would learn to practice survival like choreography. The tower cell, where Katherine had spent her final night, was cleaned and prepared for its next occupant. Guards swept away the marks her knees had left from hours of practice, erasing evidence of her desperate preparations. The block she'd used for rehearsal was returned to storage, waiting for another condemned soul who might need its terrible instruction. Only the guard who'd counted her attempts retained memory of that long night's work. In palace halls where Katherine had once walked, courtiers adjusted their behaviour to accommodate her absence. Her name joined the list of things not spoken in Henry's presence, another ghost added to the growing collection. Ladies who'd served her found new positions or faced their own accusations. The elaborate surveillance network that had documented her downfall turned its attention to fresh prey. The rules that had killed Katherine Howard lived on in careful whispers. Young women entering court learned the penalties for past affection through her example. They understood that love before royal notice constituted retroactive treason, that their histories could be rewritten as crimes. The machinery of sexual control had claimed another victim while growing stronger through use. Modern students reading Tudor history might recognize these patterns of control. The surveillance systems that watch through bedroom walls echo in today's digital observation. The transformation of past relationships into present crimes resonates with contemporary social media archaeology. Henry's England pioneered techniques of intimate control that states still use, though methods have evolved beyond spy holes and laundresses examining sheets. The moving goalposts of sexual crimes that destroyed Katherine Howard never truly stopped moving. Each generation redefined acceptable behaviour while punishing those who'd lived by previous standards. The retroactive criminalisation of normal human affection became a tool of power that outlasted the Tudor dynasty. Young women still die for loving the wrong person at the wrong time, though the scaffolds have taken different forms. In quiet moments between state executions, even Henry's most loyal servants wondered at the horror they'd helped create. They'd watched teenage girls die for crimes that hadn't been crimes when committed. They'd operated machinery designed to enable a rotting king's delusions. They'd counted spy holes and documented stains and transcribed the sounds of forced intimacy. Each had played their part in transforming bedchambers into crime scenes. The systematic nature of the horror outlived its architect. Future kings inherited the infrastructure of intimate surveillance along with their crowns. The precedents set in Tudor bedchambers shaped centuries of marriage law and sexual politics. What began as one king's paranoid need for control evolved into institutional systems that crushed countless lives. Yet, in the end, it was the small human moments that lingered. Catherine, practicing her death through the night, determined to maintain dignity in her final moments. Queens learning to breathe through calculated brutality. Servants sharing techniques for surviving another day in hell's machinery. These individual acts of courage within systematic horror remind us that humans can maintain sparks of humanity even in history's darkest chambers. The bedroom had become a battlefield where love itself was treason, where past affection meant future execution, where teenage girls practiced dying because their hearts had beaten before they met a king. The surveillance state that began with examining sheets had evolved into something that could reach back through time itself, making yesterday's innocence into today's guilt. In the Tower, where so many queens had died, servants noticed something strange in the years that followed. On February nights, when the wind blew cold, guards reported hearing sounds from the empty cell where Katherine Howard had spent her last hours. The whisper of velvet against stone, the creak of knees finding position, the soft counting of a young woman practicing movements she'd never need again. They said if you listened carefully on those nights, you could hear her still rehearsing, still counting, still perfecting the approach to a block that no longer waited. 100 times through eternity, practicing dignity in the face of horror. Some guards swore they heard other voices too, a chorus of queens whispering advice about survival, about breathing, about the angles required when love becomes law and law becomes death. The Tower's official records never mentioned these sounds, just as they'd never fully documented the bedroom horrors that had brought each queen to her end. But servants knew, guards knew, the stones themselves knew. They held the memories of systematic abuse disguised as marriage, of surveillance states born in martial beds, of rules written in blood and enforced by executioners. Henry died 3 years after Catherine, his body finally succumbing to the decay that had made his last wives' lives unbearable. Physicians recorded his final moments with the same clinical detachment they'd brought to examining queens' bodies. His death brought no justice to those he'd destroyed, only an end to one source of horror in a system designed to continue without him. The bedroom rules outlived their creator, embedded in law and custom like infection in a wound. Future generations would soften some edges while sharpening others. The spy holes might close, but new eyes would find new ways to watch. The physical examinations might end, but bodies would remain public property. The executed queens had taught their successors to perform survival, and that performance continued long after the final curtain fell. In palace halls where horror had worn a crown, in bedchambers where love had been criminalized, in tower cells where teenagers had practiced dying with dignity, the ghosts of Henry's queens lingered. Not as supernatural spirits, but as warnings written in blood and precedent. They whispered to future generations about the price of systematic control, about what happens when bedrooms become courtrooms and intimacy becomes evidence. Their message echoed through centuries in the rustle of sheets being examined, in the scratch of quills recording private moments, in the whisper of skirts approaching scaffolds. They spoke of a time when being human had been declared treason, when having a past meant having no future, when the marriage bed became an execution block waiting to claim its next victim. And in the end, that was Henry VIII's true legacy. Not the break with Rome, or the naval victories, or the political maneuvering that history books record. His legacy lived in every woman who learned to perform desire to survive, in every bedroom that became a crime scene, in every heart that learned to fear love itself. The sheets were finally burned, but the stains they'd carried spread through law and custom, seeping into the fabric of nations. The bedroom rules written in Queen's blood became templates for control that states would refine and perfect. The surveillance that started with spy holes evolved into systems that could peer into souls. 5 queens had entered Henry's bedroom. None emerged unchanged. Those who survived paid with pieces of themselves, learning to breathe through horror and perform through revulsion. Those who died left warnings written in their final moments, in the dignity they maintained despite systematic dehumanization. Their stories remind us that the distance between bedroom and scaffold can be measured in the whims of those who write the rules. The tower still stands, its stones holding memories of rehearsed deaths and practiced dignity. Tourists walk where queens once knelt, snap photos where blood once spread. They read plaques that summarize lives in sanitized sentences, never knowing about the midnight rehearsals, the mechanical horrors, the teenage girl who practiced placing her head just so because she'd loved before she'd known love was illegal. But late at night, when February wind cuts through ancient stones, some say you can still hear her counting, still practicing, still preparing for a morning that came and went 500 years ago. Katherine Howard, forever 19, forever rehearsing the perfect angle for dying because she'd lived and loved as humans do, before a king decided that being human was the greatest treason of all. The bedchamber door finally closed on Henry's reign of intimate terror, but the rules he'd written in women's blood had already escaped into the world. They would find new forms, new justifications, new victims. The spy holes might be filled, the physicians dismissed, the mechanical horrors dismantled, but the idea that love could be criminalized, that intimacy could be treason, that the state had the right to watch and judge and punish what happened between human hearts, that poison had already spread too far to ever fully cure. And somewhere in a tower cell that tourists never see, the ghost of a 19-year-old girl still kneels on cold stone, still counts to 100, still practices dying with dignity because she dared to love before a king decided love belonged only to him. Her whispered numbers fade into wind and time, but the warning remains: beware the bedroom that becomes a courtroom, beware the love that becomes law, beware the ones who watch through walls and make yesterday's innocence into tomorrow's guilt. The servants finally stopped burning the sheets, but by then it was far too late. The smoke from those fires had already poisoned the air for centuries to come.